history tells that in the 16th century, the great Inca Empire fled from the ferocious onslaught of Spanish conquistadors. Somewhere deep inside the jungles of Peru, the Incas built a last stronghold. There, they made their final stand against their ruthless enemy. But with their death, the memory of where this last refuge was disappeared. But one man was determined to find it. An American explorer named Hiram Bingham.
He was Indiana Jones. He was 6'4", he looked like a Hollywood idol. He was a man obsessed with this mission.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
And he did find an extraordinary Inca city. Machu Picchu. It was hailed as the lost city in the clouds. A spiritual Inca refuge, perching high on top of a skyscraping mountain. Bingham was convinced he had found the long-lost city of the Incas, their final refuge from the Spanish conquest. But all was not as it seemed. In 1911, there was a young scholar specializing in modern Latin American history at Yale University, USA, Hiram Bingham. But he was no impoverished academic. Bingham was 36 years old, married to Alfreda Mitchell, an heiress to the Tiffany Diamond Empire. They had 6 young sons and lived in a 30-roomed mansion on top of a hill. He was a man who seemed to have all the comforts of life. But Bingham was restless and driven.
Hiram Bingham had a really compulsive need to become famous, and I think that's because of his family.
He was Hiram Bingham III, and I think that's incredibly important because his grandfather, Hiram Bingham I, he was a very powerful, impressive missionary character, and so was his father, Hiram Bingham II. So there's this legacy, this weight on his shoulders that he had to prove himself or do something with his life at the very least.
What that something could be, he had absolutely no idea. To secure a permanent position at Yale University, Bingham went to Peru in 1909 to study the Spanish trade routes between Buenos Aires and Lima. During the journey, he was invited by his guide to see an ancient Inca site high up in the Andes Mountains. It was an event that would change his life.
It was my first introduction to prehistoric American history. I agreed, not knowing that it was going to lead me into a fascinating field.
Bingham is taken to this remote Inca ruin called Choqquequirao, which means cradle of gold, and is immediately struck by the romance of the position.
The Inca ruins lay 10,000 feet above sea level, and the climb was astounding, with breathtaking views of the distant snow-capped mountains and the roar of the Apurimac River below. It was also exhilarating.
At times, the trail was so steep that it was easier to go on all fours than to attempt to walk erect. Most of the time, we were hanging on to the side of the mountain almost by our eyelids.
On the way up, they saw amazing sights, including a huge condor that sailed down to take a look at them.
We could not only see his cruel beak and great talons, but even the whites of his eyes. It was an awe-inspiring moment.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
Eventually, they reached the Inca ruins on the flattened peak. For Bingham, it was a magical experience. Choqquequirao was built in the 15th century and was believed to be a sacred Inca dwelling and one of their frontier fortresses. It was designed to defend the approaches to their great capital city, Cusco. Bingham wrote to his wife Alfreda to tell her it was the most interesting place he had ever seen.
He's amazingly impressed by the remains of Inca architecture because he'd never known about this before. He'd heard of the Incas, but he didn't know that what they'd achieved was quite as impressive as this. Some people see this as a sort of epiphany, you know, this really changes the direction of his life.
Till now, Bingham's knowledge of South American history was limited to the Spanish colonial days, and he knew very little about the Incas. As he looked out to the distant mountains, Bingham was keen to find out more about them. Who were these people who built this extraordinary place? What was their story?
Those snow-capped peaks in an unknown and unexplored part of Peru fascinated me greatly. They tempted me to go see what lay beyond.
And he thought of this line from Kipling.
Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges.
You get this feeling that this worked on him, on his imagination, that somewhere just beyond the range was a city, a world, a reputation to be found.
Back in the Yale Library, Bingham began researching the Inca history. He opened the pages of the Spanish Chronicles, a key source on Spain's golden age of discovery, conquest, and colonization of the Americas.
He began reading more about the Incas. And of course, even as a non-academic, the story of the conquistadors and the Incas is incredibly exciting.
Bingham learned how from the early 13th century to the middle to late 16th century, the Incas were the most powerful empire in the Americas. Their domain stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Chile to the Amazon. But then came catastrophe. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, headed by their ruthless leader, Francisco Pizarro, entered the Inca heartland. He was hell-bent on their destruction. Over the next 40 years, the Spaniards drove the Indians from their cities and slaughtered them in their thousands.
Bingham really is intrigued by the history of the last Incas and what they'd done after the Spaniards arrived.
Bingham's eyes were drawn to an account where a young Inca emperor named Manco had led his people as they fled their capital city, Cusco, in 1536. Manco managed to escape the Spanish and created a new Inca capital called Vitcos, 10,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the remote mountainous region of the Vilcabamba Valley. But the Spanish conquistadors were in hot pursuit. and the Incas fled again. This time, the Chronicle said, they went down from their mountain homes into the Amazon lowland. There, protected by a dense jungle in the largest rainforest in the world, they built a new city called Vilcabamba. And it was here that the Incas made their last stand. But it was all to no avail. In 1572, the Spaniards finally defeated the Incas. And so with their death, their last refuge, Vilcabamba, disappeared from history. Bingham was transfixed by the story of Vilcabamba. But for all the references of the city, there was one vital clue missing.
Nobody, as far as he could see, knew where it was. This appealed to Bingham as a puzzle he could solve himself.
Bingham tried to work out where Vilcabamba could be. The Spanish chronicles said it lay 30 miles and 2 long days' journey from Vitcos. But he had no idea even where Vitcos was.
History Hit is an award-winning streaming platform built by history fans for history fans. Enjoy our rich library of documentaries covering key events and locations of the medieval period. History Hit's medieval offering features leading historians such as Dan Jones, Eleanor Janega, and Kat Jarman. Not only that, but we've a rich library of audio documentaries covering every period of history through our network of podcasts. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
Continuing his studies, he found another clue. The Chronicle said that Vitcos was 100 miles northwest of Cusco, along the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range. Bingham knew where Cusco was. He had visited it on his last trip to South America. But if no one knew where Vitcos was, how would he know when he'd reached it? There was a further clue in the Spanish accounts. They said that there was a sacred area with a large white rock close by the city. So if Bingham could locate the white rock, he would know he had found Vitcos. Now Bingham realized that if he could find Vitcos, then 2 days beyond it, he should be able to find Vilcabamba. This, Bingham thought, would be how he could make his name. He would lead an expedition to find the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. Bingham began to form his team.
He needed to be funded to take an expedition down there, particularly then. It was an expensive business.
The first thing Bingham did was approach a number of corporations. Businesses specializing in America's outdoor country pursuits offered their support. Abercrombie & Fitch supplied Bingham with an explorer's outfit.
He managed to get Winchester to give him a rifle, Kodak to give a camera, and then he turned to his classmates.
Bingham estimated that he would need 6 expedition members, and that each one would require $1,800 to cover their travel and food expenses. One former classmate heard about his plans and offered him $1,800 if he would take a Yale geologist with him. Bingham snapped up the offer. Others came forward. One was a topographer, another a mountain climbing engineer. Eventually, Bingham got together a multidisciplinary team.
So he's got a doctor, a naturalist, geologist, a couple of topographers. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded, versatile team.
To pay his own way, Bingham promised to write 4 articles for the fashionable Harper's magazine, but he was still $1,800 short. Only now did he turn to the one source he could rely on, his wife Alfreda, to tap the Tiffany fortune. She agreed. Bingham's party left New York for Peru on the 8th of June, 1911. Their destination? The former Inca capital city, Cusco. This, Bingham knew, lay near the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range and would be his starting off point. Bingham's expedition arrived in Cusco on the 2nd of July, 1911. His aim was to first locate the sacred white rock at Vitcos, then to make his way down from the mountains into the lowland Amazon jungle to search for Vilcabamba. Bingham and his best friend, a naturalist named Harry Foote, set out on the morning of the 19th of July 1911 on their quest for where they believed Vilcabamba could be. The rest of the party were dispatched to carry out geological and mapping surveys of the Andes.
So they head off across the high-altitude lands, then descend into the Urubamba Valley itself. And the Urubamba is the famous sacred valley of the Incas, and follow the river along, sort of heading generally in the direction northwest.
Bingham kept a meticulous diary of his expedition. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest first-hand accounts in the history of exploration.
I had entered the marvelous canyon of the Urubamba. Here the river runs through gigantic mountains of granite. I know of nowhere in the world that can compare with it.
Bingham writes in the most compulsive way. He's someone with academic authority, and yet he knows how to tell a good story.
Not only does it have great snow peaks looming above the clouds more than 2 miles overhead, it also has, in striking contrast, orchids and tree ferns, and the mysterious witchery of the jungle.
He paints pictures with words, and not just of visual things, but of the heart, you know, the spirit, what you're feeling.
One is drawn irresistibly onward by ever-recurring surprises, through a deep and winding gorge, turning and twisting past overhanging cliffs of incredible height.
He's still got a little way to go before he gets to this area where he thinks he's going to find Vitcos, the old Inca capital. So he's sort of working himself in, working the team in.
On the evening of the 23rd of July 1911, after a 70-mile journey from Cusco and 3/4 of the way to where Vitcos is said to be, Bingham and Foote set up camp for the night in a canyon surrounded by steep mountains.
They camp at a place called Mandor Pampa, and they meet a man there called Melchor Arteaga. And he questions him. He says, you know, are there ruins around here?
Arteaga told Bingham there were some fine ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu Picchu, or Old Peak.
People in Peru were always telling him that if he gave them a bit of money, they could lead him to a ruin. And there was a little bit of sort of won't get fooled again feeling in his team.
They had heard ruins were around many times, and they'd gone, it would be one little house or a couple of things.
And this is where I think we have to give a lot of credit to Bingham, because lesser men would have said, oh, for God's sake, you know, there's not supposed to be anything up that hill. There's nothing in the history books. This is just a wild goose chase.
Bingham noted the ruins' names in his pocket diary and arranged for Arteaga to take him there the following day. The morning of the 24th of July, 1911, dawned with a cold rain. Bingham prepared for his climb up Machu Picchu. His best friend Harry Foote didn't fancy the wet conditions.
The naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river. Anyway, it was my job to investigate. Arteaga shivered. He said it was too hard to climb for such a wet day. But when he found out that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage, he finally agreed to go.
Arteaga and Bingham left the camp at 10 a.m.
After a walk of about 3/4 of an hour, Arteaga left the main road and plunged down through the bank of the river. Here there was a primitive bridge which crossed the roaring rapids. It was obvious that no one could live for an instant in the icy cold rapids, but would immediately be dashed to pieces against the rocks.
He said, I admit freely, I was on my hands and knees going really, really slowly across, and all I could think of was, I hope the water doesn't go up because it'll just take the bridge away.
After the river came the mountain.
Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle. And in a few minutes, reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails.
Bingham was now climbing at nearly 8,000 feet.
Bingham was going up through very difficult cloud forest. Conditions were humid, it was hard work.
Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached several good-natured Indians who were pleasantly surprised by our unexpected arrival. It seemed that these Indians had chosen this eagle's nest for their home.
a small boy named Pablo Richarte was sent on to guide Bingham around the ruins.
He's led by this little boy around a corner, and he sees something quite extraordinary.
Hardly had we left and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight. A great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had recently been rescued from the jungle by the Indians.
It is an amazingly evocative description of firstly going through what were lovely Inca terraces, Bingham says, and then slowly things build.
From the cleared stonework, he was introduced to another spectacular sight.
Suddenly, without warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone.
And then he's going from one wonder to another.
It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Clearly, it was the work of a master artist.
Then there's the temple with the rounded wall, and then cumulatively, the overall effect.
Bingham was stunned by its magnificence and realized that this wasn't just some little Inca settlement he has come to see.
It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were as fine as the finest stonework in the world. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Suddenly we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of two of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America.
There are cyclopean stones, as he calls them. Stones the height of a human, but beautifully worked with very, very fine granite.
On the east side of the plaza was another amazing structure, the ruins of a temple containing 3 great windows looking out over the canyon to the rising sun. Like its neighbor, it is unique among Inca ruins.
Bingham had made an extraordinary discovery. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining.
I know that he had a very special Kodak camera that was made for traveling in rugged territory, and the negatives are huge. So the resolution, you know, the detail is really fantastic.
one question puzzled Bingham. Where was he?
Now, Bingham was not really looking for a ruin in this part of the world, so he couldn't make sense of what he'd found.
Machu Picchu laid 70 miles from Cusco, so it couldn't be Vitcos, which was said to be 100 miles from Cusco. And it couldn't be the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba, because that was said to be 30 miles on from Vitcos, down on the jungle plains. So what was this astonishing place? Suddenly, Bingham's eye focused on some charcoaled graffiti on a rock of the three-windowed temple. Lizarraga, 1902. His blood ran cold.
Bingham was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, and he was pulled up short. He suddenly saw this graffiti. Had some scholar got there first?
Bingham wrote the name Lizarraga 1902 in his diary and prayed it wasn't another explorer.
Maybe he'd been picked to the post. Maybe this wasn't really a discovery at all.
Deeply worried, Bingham made his way back down the mountain. He hardly mentioned the Machu Picchu ruins when he returned to the campsite below. In fact, his best friend, Harry Foote, wrote in his diary, no special things to note. Bingham discreetly asked Arteaga about the Lizarraga 1902 graffiti. Arteaga told Bingham, Augustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu. He lives at San Miguel Bridge, just downstream of your campsite.
And at that point, Hiram Bingham must have sighed and thought, oh, that is that. And he actually writes it in his diary. Lizarraga is the discoverer. And his heart must have sunk.
Bingham was horrified and set off to find the mysterious Lizarraga. But when he got to San Miguel Bridge, Augustin Lizarraga was not at home. So Bingham spoke to his brother, Angel. Angel told him that the ruins were known in the valley and parts of it were cultivated by farmers. His brother was one of those farmers. Bingham relaxed. Lizarraga wasn't a rival academic after all. He was just a local Peruvian peasant. Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu was secure. The very next day, he set off on another long journey to search for the last refuge of the Incas, Vilcabamba. But first, he had to locate the White Rock at Vitcos. Bingham followed the information detailed in the Spanish chronicles he had read back at Yale. He asked every local they passed if they knew the whereabouts of any ruins in the area, and paid local guides to lead him onwards.
He carries on down the valley into even more uncharted territory. He's put the whole thing of Machu Picchu to one side.
"15 days after encountering the ruins of Machu Picchu, Bingham came across the sacred White Rock, mentioned in the chronicles as being close to the Incas' capital city, Vitcos.
It was late on the afternoon of August 9th, 1911, when I first saw this remarkable shrine. We could now be fairly sure that we had located one of Manco's capitals, Vitcos.
If Bingham had found the ruins of the former Inca city, Vitcos, it meant that he had to be on the right track and close to completing his objective, finding their last refuge, Vilcabamba. The Chronicle said it was a long 2-day journey from Vitcos.
By now, Bingham's blood is up. I mean, he realized that these ruins are toppling over like 9 pins. You know, he's found Machu Picchu, he's found Vitcos, and there's one final place he wants to find, which is a place where the Inca Emperor and the exiles escaped to if the Spanish ever came looking for them.
Bingham came down from the mountains into the huge lowland jungles of the Amazon. This was now a very different world to the ethereal mountaintops of Machu Picchu. It was a place that even the local Peruvians feared, like the Spanish conquistadors before them.
One of our informants said the Inca city was called Espiritu Pampa, or the Plain of the Ghosts, to be reached only by a hard trail passable for barefooted savages, but scarcely available for us unless we chose to go on our hands and knees.
Finally, after several days traveling, Bingham found, beneath the thick twines of a rainforest jungle, evidence of some ruins. To his excitement, the locals called it Espiritu Pampa. Even better, they also called it Vilcabamba. Surely, Bingham had found the last refuge of the Incas. But as he set to work, he came across something very puzzling. The few buildings he had found were clearly Inca, but their stonework was rough and inferior. Bingham searched for more extensive ruins, but failed to find anything substantial. Bingham wrote in his diary,
After several days digging, ruins well scattered, long hard job to clear ruins, hardly worthwhile.
The more Bingham dug, the more he became convinced that the site just wasn't special enough to be Vilcabamba. But if this wasn't the place where the Incas had their last refuge, then where was it? Slowly, Bingham started to reconsider the evidence. He went back to the Spanish chronicles. They told him that Vilcabamba was the largest city in the province. Machu Picchu was clearly much bigger than anything he had found in the jungle. Then there was the puzzling issue of the inferior architecture. Nothing he saw in the Amazon matched the finely cut stone at Machu Picchu. Bingham also wondered about something else. Would the Incas, who are highland people, have really made a home down in the flatland jungle?
It does not seem reasonable that such people would have cared to live in the hot valley of Espiritu Pampa. These Inca ruins are unique in lying so low in the Amazon jungle. The difference in climate is as great as that between Scotland and Egypt. Furthermore, they could have found the seclusion and safety which they craved just as well in several other parts of the province, particularly at Machu Picchu.
Now he began focusing on another issue. The Chronicle stated that the city of Vilcabamba lay 2 days' march from Vitcos. So did Machu Picchu, albeit in a different direction.
Machu Picchu was roughly 2 days from Vitcos if you walked across, and he did it. He walked from Vitcos across back to Machu Picchu directly.
An idea slowly began to dawn on him. Could his discovery, Machu Picchu, be the real Vilcabamba? Bingham returned to America at the end of 1911, determined to prove his case.
After Bingham discovered Machu Picchu in 1911, there was very little publicity. Tiny mentions in the New York Times and the Geographical magazine in London, but nothing much.
Bingham revisited Machu Picchu in 1912, increasingly convinced it was Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Incas. He was now head of a major excavation and clearing program, funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Looking over the tangled city, Bingham wrote in his diary,
Machu Picchu ruins as fine as ever. Very impressive.
The material Bingham produced was so impressive that the National Geographic devoted an entire issue of their magazine to his discovery.
The owner of National Geographic magazine said, we're going to make Machu Picchu a star, and moreover, Mr. Bingham, we're going to make you a star as well.
In April 1913, with the cover title, In the Wonderland of Peru, National Geographic published in pictures and text Bingham's amazing account of his finding of Machu Picchu. The news was a global sensation. The public needed little convincing. Finally, it became accepted that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the Incas' final refuge. And Hiram Bingham's name was made. Hiram Bingham would go down in history as one of the all-time great explorers. But there is an irony in this tale. Machu Picchu was an amazing Inca site. However, modern scholars now believe that the ruins at Espiritu Pampa, which Bingham had dismissed in 1911, are far grander and larger than he had realized.
In 1964, some 50 years after Bingham had been there, an American called Gene Savoy, an adventurer and archaeologist, went down to Espiritu Pampa and did a much more thorough clearing of the site, and established really beyond doubt that that was indeed the proper last refuge of the Incas, which I think all archaeologists would agree today.
Bingham's initial detective work that had led him to Espiritu Pampa had been on the right trail after all. He had found the real Vilcabamba. He just hadn't realized it. So if Machu Picchu wasn't the last refuge of the Incas, what was it? Today, Machu Picchu is believed to have been built by the Incas during the expansion of their empire in the mid-15th century, 75 years before the Spanish arrived. It was constructed as a royal estate and served as a sacred and seasonal retreat for the Inca rulers whenever the weather was severe in their capital city, Cusco.
Everyone now tends to the view that it was built as a winter palace for an Inca emperor, probably the greatest of them all, Pachacuti. He could come down with his retinue to Machu Picchu, which has a much better climate, and enjoy a fabulous resort-type atmosphere. It was a very exclusive place, which is perhaps why there was no historical record of it. It was a place where an emperor could build his own fantasy creation in the clouds, a sort of Las Vegas, if you like, which, if it didn't have neon billboards, did have this show-off architecture that only an emperor could afford.
Scholars now believe Machu Picchu was abandoned by the Incas long before the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. Why they left their great winter retreat, however, remains a mystery. So where does that leave Hiram Bingham today? Was he just an adventurer who allowed his prejudice and emotions to get the better of him? Most would regard that as too harsh. To many explorers, he remains a hero.
Hiram Bingham was the perfect man of the moment. Here was a character with a dream, someone who wished to find treasure, and that is exactly what he did.
He made the discovery both of Machu Picchu and of other very important Inca sites. I think in many ways he is a bit of a hero, and rather more of a hero perhaps than Indiana Jones, because he's real.
He was the first scientific discoverer, the man who took the time, brought money to the enterprise, who exposed Machu Picchu to the world, literally peeling back that forest and showing us what an extraordinary place it was.
I was so happy that he had had the energy and the curiosity and the drive to find Machu Picchu, to rediscover it, to write about it, to make it famous to the whole world so other people could come and really enjoy it.
Despite being wrong about Vilcabamba and Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham is still regarded as one of the greatest explorers of his age. After all, perhaps, he found one of the great wonders of the modern world.
The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer. Yet here, in a remote part of the canyon, on a narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun.